Hello, and welcome to the Ancient Journey. On today's journey, the Aberfan Premonitions. Before we get started, don't forget, if you enjoy the video, please give us a like and a share, and if you're into our content, please subscribe. It helps grow the channel, and it keeps us producing these videos. Had it happened a few months earlier, it might not have even been a story at all. It may not have been a big story had it happened just one day later. In fact, if it had happened just a few hours earlier, tragedy could have been averted. But on the morning of Friday, October 21st, 1966, a rolling wall of death steamrolled towards the tiny village of Aberfan. Weeks of heavy rain had inundated the small mining region in Wales. In the hills up above the village of Aberfan, the National Coal Board had been storing coal spoils since the early 1900s. The coal spoils grew in size until some measured 111 feet tall. To put that into perspective, the Statue of Liberty, measured from her feet to the top of her head, is about 111 feet tall. While rain pounded the surface of the slurry piles from above, a more sinister problem was occurring beneath them. Unknown or ignored at the time, water springs began to seep groundwater from beneath the piles. Tons of coal slurry, made heavier and looser from the storm, now also sat atop a slippery, wet hillside. The tiny town of around 5,000 people awoke that Friday morning and went about their day, eating breakfasts, getting dressed, and rushing off to work or school. Many of the townspeople were employed in the mining industry. Children were arriving to the Pantglass School on Moy Road for their last day before their half-term holiday. By 9:15 a.m., the slurry pile broke loose and had roared down the hillside and engulfed the school. Traveling at around 20 miles per hour, the thick mud, sludge, and rubble smashed into the school, filling classrooms with a cold, wet, crushing slurry. Along the way, the landslide broke open water mains underground, adding even more water to the pile and helping it move along at an even faster and more dangerous speed. The pile, as it surges forward, has the sound and feel of a low, roaring thunderstorm. Many staff were in the process of taking attendance and collecting lunch money for the day, and some died protecting the children. Nancy Williams, a cafeteria worker, used her body to shield 5 children. She was found dead with lunch money still in her hand. The 5 children survived. Di Benyon, the assistant principal of the school, tried to use a blackboard to stop the advancing wall of death. He and all 34 students in his classroom were killed. Once the avalanche ended, an eerie silence filled the town. One resident recalled that you could not hear a single bird or child making a sound. A mound of slurry measuring 30 feet tall blocked the area. Even more sinister, as the landslide came to a rest, it would harden. The broken water mains continued to spew water into the pile, and parts of the slip continued to bulldoze through the village. It took until 11:30 for town authorities to quell the supply of water. The mains had added close to 4 million gallons of water to the slurry, about 6 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth. Leading up to the disaster, there were many issues with the slurry piles. There were frequent smaller slides and leaks in the years leading up to the disaster. Once rescue efforts had completed, the landslide had claimed 109 students and 5 teachers from the school. In total, nearly 150 people in the town were killed. Their causes of death were asphyxia, crush injuries, fractured bones, and skulls. In early October, a 10-year-old schoolgirl named Errol Mae Jones marched into her kitchen and told her mother, "Mummy, I'm not afraid to die." Errol's mother scoffed at her daughter. telling her she was too young to die and not to worry. But on October 20th, Errol awoke from a terrible nightmare. I dreamt I went to school, and there was no school there. Something black had come down all over it. Errol went to school the next day and was killed in the disaster. On the eve of the disaster, an 8-year-old boy named Paul Davies had drawn a group of figures digging in the hillside, under the words, "The End." Davies died in the disaster the next day. Another woman, Carolyn Miller, also had a vision of the disaster on the same night. I saw an old schoolhouse nestling in a valley, then a Welsh miner, then an avalanche of coal hurtling down a mountainside. At the bottom of this mountain of hurtling coal was a little boy with a long fringe, looking absolutely terrified to death. Then for a while I saw rescue operations taking place. I had an impression that the little boy was left behind and saved. He looked so grief-stricken. I could never forget him, and also with him was one of those rescue workers, wearing an unusual peaked cap. Carolyn shares her vision with a friend from church the next day, as well as a neighbor, who verify her story. And Carolyn is astonished the next day to see news of the Aberfan disaster. On the news footage, to her great dismay, is the boy from her vision and his rescuer, just as she had seen them in her mind. 2 nights before the disaster, a 63-year-old man from Bacup in Lancashire had dreamed that he was facing a large machine, which he thought might be a computer. Letters on the screen spelled Aberfan, a word he had no connection to. Mary Hennessy also found herself sharing strange dreams that night. At the end of the room there were long pieces of wood or wooden bars. The children were trying somehow to get over the top or through the bars. I tried to warn someone by calling out, but before I could do so, one little child just slipped out of sight. I myself was watching from the corridor. The next thing in my dream was hundreds of people, all running towards the same place. The look on people's faces was terrible. Some were crying and others holding handkerchiefs to their faces. It frightened me so much that it woke me up. Early the morning of the 21st, she calls her son and daughter-in-law at 8:45 and explains to them, "I'm very worried because the dream was about children. It makes me think about the grandchildren. I know I dreamed about school children, but please just take special care of them." It's important to note that Miller and Hennessy have no connection to Aberfan and yet still share these visions. In a nearby town, Dr. John Barker, a psychiatrist, takes time to visit Aberfan during the aftermath of the landslide. Barker has the weary eyes and the tired body of a man many years older than he was at the time. A well-respected and transformative scholar, Barker could be energetic and imposing at times. He had also been an authority figure at several mental hospitals across Britain. Barker was among many who visited to view the spectacle. Barker could be a large and a loud man, but he was also deeply interested in futuristic mental conditions and psychic abilities. Barker had been researching a book about psychic death, something that happens to people when they believe they are about to die. The book had been titled Scared to Death. The scenes of Aberfan sickened him, reminding him of London in World War II, where stunned and saddened townsfolk wandered through streets of bombed-out rubble. However, Barker felt sure that such a tragedy could have been sensed ahead of time by any persons who were sensitive to such premonitions. During his visit, John is struck by the family speaking of dreams and premonitions leading up to the disaster. Barker persuades a newspaper, the London Evening Standard, to run an article asking if anyone had visions or premonitions about the events in Aberfan. To his surprise, the newspaper receives 26 letters. Of those 26, Barker eliminates those that are vague or unbelievable. He then sets about verifying the stories that the remaining letters contain. Through them, he comes upon the story of Errol May, the young girl who stated she was not afraid to die. Strangely, some of the letters were from people who had never heard of Aberfan or lived anywhere near it, such as Hennessy and Miller. While no one vision was specific enough to have avoided the disaster, many of the letters were verified as true. Errol May's story was verified by a local minister and her parents. Barker would refer to the author of these letters as human seismographs, or those who were sensitive in some way to upcoming events. Barker was a member of Britain's Society for Paranormal Research, which had been founded in 1882. In a paper he wrote for them, he explained the common problem of the Aberfan Premonitions. Firstly, because these premonitions would probably have been insufficiently clear, and secondly, he wrote, because no means existed for them to communicate them to the proper authorities. Barker's father was an accountant and had told him of supernatural experiences he had endured while serving on the front lines of World War I. Barker would often ghost hunt in local towns, and he became fascinated with premonitions during his schooling from reading about fortune tellers predicting the death of people years before their death actually occurred. He believes that medicine and psychiatry only told one part of the story, or that there was more out there. While working on Scared to Death, Barker would consult psychics and ask if they could predict the date and the cause of his death. Only one psychic would take a guess, and she happened to get it wrong. But there would be more warnings to come for Barker. Barker could understand the skepticism around these premonitions, so he started another experiment in 1967. He would ask readers of the London Evening Standard to send in letters detailing their visions for 1 full year. When a letter would arrive at the newspaper, it would be date-stamped for recording purposes. After the year, the letters would be compared to actual events and given a rating as to how accurate the letter was compared to an event. Barker dreamed the experiment could become a storage vault for the nation's premonitions and visions. In the spring of 1967, Alan Hencher, someone who had also shared a premonition of the Aberfan disaster, alerted Barker of a plane crash in an area he described as over the mountains. He detailed the death toll at 123 to 124 persons. 30 days later, a Britannia passenger plane crashes into a hill in Cyprus, Greece, killing 126 people. Interestingly, 2 persons died later in the day after the crash, so the initial headline lists the death toll at exactly 124. Barker had finally found someone he thought to be his psychic. He made arrangements to visit with Hencher the next day, but at close to midnight, Barker's phone rings. It is Hencher with another premonition, this time about Barker himself. "Have you a dark-colored car? Be careful. Look after yourself," Hencher tells him. Nothing happens to Barker the next day. However, Hencher is proven to still be accurate later that year when he reveals another vision, this one shared by another participant in the experiment, Kathleen Lorna Middleton. Middleton sees a railway crash, and in a vision she sees a crowd on a railway platform above them the words Charing Cross. 4 days later, a passenger train derails, killing 49 people. Hencher works evenings, and at the time the crash occurs he feels ill and has a tremendous headache, and he is documented as being taken to the infirmary at his place of employment. The train accident happens on a busy service line, which handles passengers from Hastings to London's Charing Cross station. Hencher and Middleton continue to provide Barker with visions of his demise. Hencher tells Barker in 1968 that his life is still in danger. Middleton has a vision of Barker where she sees his head and shoulders on one side of a room, and her deceased parents on the other side of the room. Middleton's dream reoccurs for over a week. Middleton begins warning of the assassination of Robert Kennedy on March 11, 1968, almost 3 months before he's killed. But in the 18 months since the experiment is first launched, the 2 most reliable participants in the study, Middleton and Hencher, both continue to believe that Barker is about to die. Middleton awakens in her Edmonton, London residence on August 18, 1968, choking and gasping for air. She is having another vision. She cries out for help, and at the same time, in Yokelton, some 3 hours away, the 44-year-old Dr. John C. Barker suffers a brain hemorrhage and dies. Is it possible that some people can tell the future? Or are all these just lucky guesses or vague stories that are bent to fit a narrative after the fact? Would Barker still be dead if he hadn't received the warnings from Middleton, or could he have avoided his fate? Or is it possible that once your number's up, that's it? And if that's the case, then would you want to know about it ahead of time or not? Thanks for watching, and thanks for sharing the journey.